Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
As a child, I remember older relatives saying that they could tell the weather from how their joints felt. Cold and damp weather seemed to be particularly challenging. Lots of people make the snow migration from the frozen Midwest and further north to Arizona in the winter because their joints can't handle the cold weather, and they're much more comfortable when they get to Arizona. And with our senior horses, we often hear owners who don't want to put them through another winter, not because they're struggling to hold weight, but because their joint pain escalates and it seems hard for them to get around, and their owners just don't want to put them through that again. Joint supplements are a hot topic year-round, but take on a special relevance in the winter months. So today we thought we'd take a look at some of the different ingredients out there and what we know about them.
I agree that the joints hurt in the winter. As somebody that lives in the frozen tundra, my joints always hurt. I can always tell when it's going to rain or going to snow, and I think it is an old person.
You're not even that old.
I know. The older we get, the more I can feel it. And I'm also going to make the snowbird migration this winter. So
that's true, you are. Well, it's interesting because I'm older than you and I don't feel my joints in the winter, but I've also lived in the non-frozen Arizona winter for the last, 7 years. So yeah, note to self, don't go to Iowa in the winter.
It definitely seems like joint supplements are a really popular class of supplements that a lot of people are giving their horses. And This topic actually came as a listener request, so shout out to Karen who asked us to do this episode, and let's get started.
Yeah, thanks for the request, Karen. We always love listener requests, so send those in, anybody that has them. But yeah, absolutely, we're all giving our horses lots of supplements, right? I mean, guilty as charged. And joint supplements are right up there. And it's just not, though we all go in the feed room and go, oh my gosh, look at how many supplements Mary's feeding her horse. And look how many Sally's feeding her horse. And, but it's the research actually backs up that we are really actually feeding a lot of supplements. So in a survey of horse owners that came out in 2017, Sworsley and colleagues reported that 84% of horse owners were giving supplements to one or more horses under their care. So that's like most of us. And it wasn't influenced by the competitive status of the horse or the discipline they competed in. So if you think, well, it's just a competition horse thing, no, that's not true. Work looking at dressage and eventing horses in the United Kingdom found that the main reason for giving supplements to dressage horses was energy, behavior, so kind of like behavior modifying, lameness, and then back and muscle problems. And then in event horses, the reasons were stamina and fitness, lameness, and energy and behavior again. And then there were similar results found in an Irish study that Murray and colleagues did in 2018, where 34% of respondents used a supplement to prevent joint disease, 35% to enhance performance, and 13% were giving a calming supplement. So lameness and joint issues have repeatedly come up in research as reasons to administer supplements. And this is true whether the horse is a competition horse, a pleasure horse, and regardless of the competitive discipline.
What is it that we're all hoping that these supplements will do for our horses?
Well, as you know, I have a horse that has some sort of osteoarthritic changes, and I can tell you that the reason I give joint supplements is that I want to try and reduce any further damage to those joints, but I also want to minimize any inflammation that's in those joints that could be causing discomfort. And I know you give Dash a joint supplement. Why are you giving it?
I just give it as a preventative measure to support joint health and, hopefully before any signs appear.
Right.
There's an actual clinical issue.
No, so you're doing it. Yeah. So whereas it's like, so I know I have something, right, that I'm trying to kind of mitigate, and you're trying to prevent there from being something. And I think those are the two main reasons, right, why people give them right there. So we're kind of a good case in point there. And we both are giving joint supplements, and we're giving different ones. So it's kind of interesting. But years ago, I did an Ask the Vet live when I used to do articles for the horse. And the veterinarian that did it with me, she made a really good point that the questions we should be asking when considering a joint supplement are you trying to prevent or reduce the risk of joint degeneration and osteoarthritis? Or are you trying to reduce inflammation? Because the ingredients that help with these things are potentially different. And of course, if you're like me, then you're trying to achieve both things. So I think that's a good question for people to ask themselves, right? Like, just think about for a second, if you're motivated to give a joint supplement, why? And what is it exactly you want it to do? Because that's going to help you pick what ingredients are in the product you go with.
When we look at ingredients in joint supplements, it seems some of them have been around forever. And
right.
Others are newer, and some may not be as familiar to our listeners.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, I think we would all argue that glucosamine, chondroitin, MSM, and probably hyaluronic acid at this point have been around, like you said, forever, and they're really familiar to most people in the joint supplement category, whereas ingredients like, let's say, rose hips might be less familiar. And recently, it's become common to include ingredients that are actually included to support soft tissue and bone, such as boron, for example, for bone health. So now we have these joint supplements used to just literally be glucosamine, chondroitin, MSM, and HA. And now they have a slew of other things in there that are not necessarily specifically for joint health, but maybe for associated kind of soft tissue support.
Well, let's start with glucosamine and chondroitin. So what are they and what do they do?
So glucosamine and chondroitin are frequently given together, right? So you often see them in a product. You rarely see them on their own. They're nearly always given together. And that's because they have complementary roles to each other in cartilage metabolism. And they potentially work synergistically, so kind of better together than alone. And glucosamine is something called an amino sugar, meaning that it's a sugar where one of the oxygen-hydrogen groups, we talked about fats last time and all these chemical structures. So in case there are any listeners who like the chemistry out there, one of the oxygen-hydrogen groups has been replaced with a nitrogen-hydrogen group. And so they are essentially sugars in their simplest form. And so glucosamine is a key precursor in the biosynthesis of something called glucosaminoglycans. That's a very big word. Which we abbreviate to GAGs. So people might have heard of GAGs before. That's shorthand for glucosaminoglycans. And these are essential components of cartilage.
Can you explain these different parts of the joint?
I can try. So if you think about two bones coming together, I mean, actually you can kind of do it if you think about I think about making two fists and putting my knuckles together, right? And that's kind of a joint. And, where your two fists are touching, where those bones are touching, there's friction, right? And if those rub together long enough, you feel your knuckles rubbing on each other, it's kind of uncomfortable, right? It's kind of an uncomfortable feeling if you're kind of rubbing your knuckles together. Those bones would erode each other. So to prevent that from happening, there is a space between the bones, right? They don't actually touch. There's a small fluid filled space. That fluid is synovial fluid, right? That's as we call joint fluid, and it acts as a lubricant. And the ends of the bones are covered with a slippery, kind of white, slimy, kind of cushioning substance called articular cartilage, which also helps reduce friction. And then the whole joint is encased. Think about this kind of skin, and the joint is encased in something called a synovial membrane. And that synovial membrane is what secretes the joint fluid, the synovial fluid, into the joint. So if there's damage to the joint, the synovial membrane might release more fluid into the joint space to try and provide more cushioning and more nutrients to try and heal that joint. But obviously you've got an enclosed system, right? So if you keep putting more fluid into the same space, it's going to create a lot of pressure, and that can be painful. So some listeners may have experienced seeing this pressure if you've ever watched a horse receiving joint injections. So I'm thinking like hocks is a very common one, right? The veterinarian will insert the needle into that space between the two bones, and they're basically like tapping into that joint fluid, right? And if there's a lot of pressure in that joint, if there's a lot of fluid in that joint, sometimes that needle will drip fluid out of it before they attach the syringe to the needle. There'll be fluid dripping out of that needle, which tells you that there's a lot of pressure in that joint that is pushing itself out of that needle because it's under such high pressure. So people may have seen that. So if the cartilage is not adequately maintained, then the ends of the bone may no longer be protected, or the ends of the bone may develop like bony arthritic changes, all of which can increase friction and cause more inflammation and more pain. So you sort of end up in this cycle, right? So we're trying to protect that whole system and environment, and different ingredients play a role in different pieces of that like ecosystem, for want of a better expression.
So glucosamine is helping support the synthesis of compounds needed to make articular cartilage.
Yes, it's a precursor to those compounds, those GAGs that we mentioned earlier. Glucosamine is a precursor to that, and they attract water, and they're used as lubricants and shock absorbers. So chondroitin sulfate is actually a glucosaminoglycan. It's a GAG. And glucosamine is actually a building block of chondroitin sulfate. And so it's thought to be, the greatest use for potential inhibition of osteoarthritis. So it's one of the reasons why we give horses glucosamine and chondroitin is they are really important in this maintenance of articular cartilage. And there are 3 different types of glucosamine. So you've got like commercially available forms of glucosamine. There's glucosamine hydrochloride, which you'll see on labels sometimes as HCl, glucosamine HCl. There's glucosamine sulfate, and then there's N-acetyl D-glucosamine, which you don't really see. And the HCl and sulfate forms have been shown to have the greatest inhibitory effect on cartilage degradation in vitro, meaning like in an experiment, like not in an actual horse, like in a model type setting. And the hydrochloride version provides about 80% of its weight in glucosamine. So when you give, 10 grams of glucosamine hydrochloride, you're giving 8 grams of glucosamine. So it's very commonly used in supplements because you get a lot of glucosamine, for your, you put 100 grams of this stuff in, you're going to get 80 grams of glucosamine. So you get a lot of glucosamine. So that's always really helpful. The concentration of glucosamine is really high. However, with the sulfate form, that's thought to be more efficacious, despite only providing 50 to 60% of its weight of glucosamine. So you get less glucosamine for that same, say, 100 grams, but it seems to work better. So when you're looking at product labels, they should tell you which form of glucosamine they're using. You're probably most commonly going to see the HCl form because the manufacturer can kind of give you more glucosamine in the same serving size than they could if they used sulfate. But the sulfate form may actually be more effective at protecting the joint. And glucosamine is considered to be very safe. There are studies where they've fed 5 times the recommended serving for several months with no known ill effects. So it is a pretty safe ingredient.
And chondroitin?
Yeah, so chondroitin sulfate, as I mentioned, that also contributes to this articular cartilage. And it particularly helps with the resilience of the cartilage by promoting water retention and maintaining its elasticity of that collagen matrix. You want that cartilage to be springy and moist and slippery, and you want it to think of it like being a damper, right? It's kind of between the bones to kind of stop them. If you think of a horse jumping and it lands on its foot and those bones are going to come together, you need that kind of squishy like cushion between those two bones to try and so the bones don't, bump into each other. And so that's why cartilage is so important. It's rarely found as a sole ingredient in joint supplements because it's expensive and it's very hard to synthesize. So as a result, quality and quantity of the chondroitin sulfate in the supplement can be a bit concerning. So it's one reason to go with companies that, you trust, and that, I always worry about sort of, you get joint supplements from all over the place, right? There's all sorts of tiny companies like, who is this company? And, do I really have faith that they're using really high quality ingredients, that they're saying what's in there is what's really in there? But chondroitin is that building block of hyaluronic acid, right? So we kind of got a chain going here. So it's a building block of hyaluronic acid, and it inhibits the effects of various enzymes that degrade cartilage. So as I mentioned before, you're going to see chondroitin and glucosamine used together because they complement each other. And there are clinical studies in horses that have yielded sort of mixed results, with some reporting improved joint function and lameness scores that are better when fed glucosamine and chondroitin. And then there are other studies that show like minimal benefit. So the jury's a little bit out, but I think in general, people feel that, there is enough sort of scientific research out there to justify giving these two as oral supplements. Oral bioavailability does remain a concern, and it limits the extent to which these compounds reach the joint space. So, there have definitely been studies where they've looked at the joint fluid and said, well, we've given these ingredients and the concentration of them in the joint fluid hasn't changed. And that's been used as justification to say that oral joint supplements with these ingredients don't work. At the same time, there are other studies where they've shown, an improvement in stride length, for example, in horses that are fed glucosamine and chondroitin versus those that aren't. So, okay, maybe it's not getting to the joint, but the horse is moving better. So what's going on there, right? And we don't necessarily understand the mechanism of how all these things work necessarily. And I think oftentimes, we may be looking at sort of an anti-inflammatory effect where you're reducing the inflammatory status of the whole horse. And so you see an improvement in their movement, even though you don't see a change in the level of these particular ingredients in their joint fluid. So it's a tricky area of research.
And what about hyaluronic acid? A lot of times on supplements, this is just listed as HA.
Yep, absolutely. So you kind of have to have all your, like your glucosamine HCl and your HA. And we often, what do they think of, with HA kind of thing, have different versions. It used to be that, you just had your glucosamine, chondroitin, MSM, and then they'd have the version with HA. HA used to be the sort of like the new kid on the block, and now it's been around for decades, so it's not really the new kid anymore. But yeah, hyaluronic acid, it's an important component of joint fluid and cartilage. So again, it's helping provide lubrication and shock absorption, and it's known to help maintain the cells in the joint. So it's frequently included intra-articularly, meaning straight into the joint when we inject steroids into joints. HA can also be given intravenously. Your veterinarian might give it intravenously. And in these applications, it works really quite well. I know my veterinarian includes hyaluronic acid whenever, he's doing steroid injections into joints. And it really seems to help. And as a result of that success, it became very popular as an oral ingredient as well. But the problem is that there's research in other species that suggests that its oral bioavailability may not be very good. But there are some positive results that have been seen in horse studies. So again, with all these ingredients, the research is pretty limited, right? There's not a ton of research. So again, a bit of a mixed bag, but we do have some positive research in horses. Although not significant, when 250 milligrams were given per day to young horses for 60 days, those horses tended to have lower scores for synovial swelling, so found joint swelling, than those that weren't given 250 milligrams per day. And that's a little higher than you typically see on most supplements, right? I think you typically see more sort of 50 to 200 milligrams. It's unusual to see 250 milligrams.
Yes.
When it was fed in another study at a lower dose, 100 milligrams to yearlings for 30 days after arthroscopic surgery, so that's joint surgeries, right? The treated horses, the horses that had the HA, had significantly lower levels of joint swelling compared to the controls. So again, there is some benefit in equine studies. And you are looking in that sort of probably 100 to 200, maybe 250 milligrams per head per day to be effective.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, glucosamine is a building block of chondroitin sulfate, which is in turn a building block of hyaluronic acid. I'm not sure whether our listeners will have known that these components actually exist in their horse's joints naturally.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think you might be right, because it's not uncommon for clients to have sort of an apparent, I see them having this like light bulb moment when I'm talking to them about this. And typically the context in which it comes up is that I'll be asked by a client, should I be giving my horse an oral joint supplement? And I always say, well, if the base diet isn't balanced, then the answer is, I think adding a joint supplement is kind of a waste of money, right? So, and the reason why I say that is that there are key nutrients in your horse's diet that are necessary for the natural production of these compounds. So, for example, you need manganese to make chondroitin sulfate, and you need copper to make collagen. So, if your horse's diet is deficient in copper and manganese, they're not going to be able to naturally support their own joints very well, right? So it seems like a false economy to then go and spend, what a joint supplement is, $1.50, $2, $3 a day on a joint supplement, while you're feeding a diet that's deficient in these key trace minerals that would help the horse make their own chondroitin sulfate and strong collagen. And I think people don't realize that, chondroitin sulfate exists naturally in your horse. Your horse makes its own chondroitin sulfate. He makes his own hyaluronic acid. He makes his own glucosamine. That's why we're giving them these ingredients, is to kind of help bolster their own levels of these things that they're already naturally making. My starting point is always, can we help the horse make his own as effectively as possible? And then if you've done that and you want to add a joint supplement, great, go ahead. But I think it's a bit of a false economy to be spending $3 a day on a joint supplement while feeding a diet that's deficient in copper and manganese and other really important trace minerals and anti-inflammatory, ingredients.
So glucosamine helps the body make chondroitin, and chondroitin helps make HA, and glucosamine and chondroitin are promoting healthy cartilage, and HA is helping to lubricate the joint. So they're all acting preventatively.
Yes. Yeah, they're helping that joint environment be as healthy as it can be.
What about ingredients that might help with existing inflammation?
So probably one of the ingredients that folks are most familiar with that kind of falls into this category, which again has been around for donkey's years, that's a funny thing, donkey's years. I guess donkeys live. You've never heard of that? Jill's making a very funny face. Donkeys live a very long time. It's not uncommon for donkeys to live 40 years. So that's a saying in England, something lives donkey's years, or it was donkey's years ago. It's a long time ago.
It sounded like you were saying donkey's ears.
No, years, donkey's years.
Donkey's ears are long, so I was like, okay, but anyway.
Well, I guess that works too. Anyway, donkey's ears. Anyway, MSM has been around a long time in joint supplements. So you'll probably see it again on labels as MSM, which actually stands for methyl sulfonyl methane, which is quite a mouthful, so we just say MSM. But the methyl sulfonyl methane does give you a hint of what it's bringing to the table, which is a naturally occurring source of organic sulfur. And so it's a long-standing ingredient in joint nutraceuticals for that reason. So while it's not incorporated directly into the horse's tissue, it has been found to be a powerful antioxidant that's well studied in animal models, as well as in human clinical trials. So research looking at biomarkers of oxidative stress and in horses, in jumping horses, so we've got some research in horses too, found that all markers were decreased after competition compared to controls when horses were fed 8 milligrams per kilogram of MSM per day. So if you've got a 500 kilogram horse, you have to multiply that by 8 milligrams to figure out how many milligrams you'd have to feed your horse to have that effect, right? Additionally, when they added 5 milligrams per kilogram of vitamin C, in addition to the MSM, the values of some of the markers were similar to those found before the competition. So these can be quite effective in mitigating oxidative stress. not, necessarily, I don't recall off the top of my head whether that was done specifically in joints or whether that was systemic oxidative markers. But, we do have research into these things. And you'll sometimes see vitamin C in joint supplements too. And most commonly, I think we think about giving vitamin C to horses with respiratory issues. That's the most typical time we use vitamin C. But it's also important for the production of connective tissues like tendons and ligaments. So you'll sometimes see it included in products that are supporting soft tissues as well as joints. And while horses do make their own vitamin C, there is a small amount of evidence that suggests that when horses are stressed, that they might not be able to make enough vitamin C and that they might benefit from dietary supplementation. So it's kind of sometimes put in products, especially for tendons and ligaments, as sort of a kind of just a guarantee in case your horse isn't making enough. So I think it's important to know about MSM is that I believe MSM is a prohibited substance for those competing in endurance. So as with any supplement, if you're competing, you do need to check your organization's regulations as to whether ingredients can be given prior to and during competition. I know that there are some joint supplements that actually include green tea. And green tea can be a source of caffeine. Obviously, caffeine is a prohibited substance in some disciplines, although there are versions of green tea that are fine and don't have caffeine in them. And so some of the manufacturers using, green tea that doesn't have caffeine are able to provide letters saying that, their product is fine to compete on. But, you just need to be aware of these things. While we're on the topic of prohibited substance in joint products, like devil's claw, right? Devil's claw, you'll see that. That's prohibited.
Does SmartPak still have that on their site? Not Devil's Claw, but they used to have...
Oh, the green tea?
Well, no, it used to say, like, if it was a prohibited substance, when you did the comparison of the products. I don't know
if it does. It might. I would caution, though, that, the rules are changing all the time.
All the time.
Substances that are allowed and not allowed are changing all the time, especially this time of year. December 1st is the beginning of the USEF calendar year. And so, things have changed. And so really the onus is on the owner trainer of the horse to make sure that they understand, what is and is not prohibited. I just know for sure MSM is not allowed for endurance. At least I'm 99% certain. Somebody said that it wasn't 2 weeks ago when I was chatting about MSM. Green tea can be an issue depending on its source. Devil's claw is not allowed in certain disciplines. And so devil's claw will be in joint supplements, especially for senior horses. It does seem to help mitigate pain. And so devil's claw is definitely a prohibited substance. And I feel like yucca is in some places too. But anyway, joint supplements definitely, like many things, if they're effective, unfortunately, they're not always allowed. So just don't get yourself into trouble accidentally. But if you've got a senior horse living in the field and, you want to try something that's got devil's claw in it, fine. You're not competing. It doesn't matter.
Are there any newer ingredients that support the inflammatory response?
Yeah, although I'm not sure they're really newer. Perhaps they're just not so commonly used, so they might appear new to listeners who are looking at labels. 3 that come to mind are resveratrol, and it feels new, but I think really it's probably been around about 10 years. Green-lipped Purina mussel, which again has been around a long time, but seems to be making a comeback. And then ASU, and no, not Arizona State University.
The joint supplement I feed has ASU in it. So let's start with that one. What is ASU?
I know. If you live in Arizona and you see that as ASU, like you just spend the whole time saying "Go Devils," and anyway. But no, that's not what we're talking about. So ASU in this context is, I'm going to try and say it now, avocado, soybean, unsaponifiables. So yeah, again, just say ASU, right? All these things have such huge mouthfuls between hyaluronic acid and methosulfite or whatever. So just use the abbreviations. They're plant-derived extracts. So ASUs are plant-derived extracts primarily made up of phytosterols and tocopherol. So we think of tocopherols, we're thinking like vitamin E, right? Is a for example of a tocopherol, they're made up of tocopherols, of fat-soluble fractions obtained from avocados and soybean oils. So these are naturally occurring compounds that get extracted out of those oils. And in humans and dogs, ASU has been demonstrated to be joint protective and to also have anti-inflammatory effects, including inhibition of the pro-inflammatory cytokines. So it's a really interesting ingredient, and it also stimulates cartilage matrix synthesis. So it's going to help, keep that cartilage barrier functional, hopefully. There are some limited studies in horses, but when osteoarthritis was induced, so what they did was, so you induce osteoarthritis by actually doing surgery, right? So you do surgery on a joint and you disrupt that joint and you basically induce arthritis. And the reason you do this sort of in a surgical setting is that every horse is then given the same kind of arthritis, and it allows you to really control for the type of arthritis and the severity of the arthritis, and then test the efficacy of the ingredient. Whereas if you take sort of naturally occurring, hock arthritis, for example, it's quite difficult to get multiple horses with the exact same level and severity and type of arthritis in their hock. So it's induced surgically, and then they treated them with the ASU, and it significantly reduced the severity of the articular cartilage erosion and the synovial hemorrhage that occurred. It also increased the production of GAGs in the joint cartilage. So you're going to get more of the glucosamine, chondroitin compounds being made. So ASU can stimulate that, which is obviously very beneficial. And clinical trials in naturally occurring osteoarthritis, though, are pretty limited, pretty sparse. So, but it is an interesting, years ago, I want to say it was like 2010, I heard a leading joint surgeon talk about ASU. And this is a surgeon, globally recognized equine surgeon who, frankly, if you knew him, his opinion was, why would you give anything orally? If you want to do something in a joint, just stick it straight in the joint kind of mentality. And he had actually done some of the research on ASU and was actually very complimentary about it. And I think he was surprised. By his own admission, he was surprised that it had actually worked as well as he didn't expect it to work that well, because he was not a big believer in oral supplements. So it kind of made me sit up and go, well, if he feels he saw a benefit of it in his research, then there's probably something to it. So it is an ingredient that I will look for in supplements, and it's not in very many supplements. So your choices are limited.
What about the other ingredients you mentioned?
The resveratrol and the mussel. Yeah, the resveratrol, that's a potent anti-inflammatory. It's in some joint supplements, and people are probably familiar with it because it's the compound we think of coming from red grape skins. But it also comes from, resveratrol is what we're all getting when we drink red wine. You crush your red wine, you crush your grape skins, and it's got resveratrol in it. So that's one of the sort of antioxidant properties of drinking red wine. So, but it's also found in blueberries and Japanese knotweed. Not that we're going to be feeding those to our horses, but it's it's one of these, it's a class of polyphenolic compounds, and it's in mammals. It has anti-inflammatory, antioxidative, and anti-apoptotic effects. Apoptosis or apoptosis, I'm probably saying it wrong. It's me being English and not American. But anyway, that's basically programmed cell death, right? So it's your body's way of cleaning house. It's kind of, we kill off certain cells periodically to move them on out. And so that's what apoptosis is. But in lab animal studies with resveratrol, where again, they experimentally induced osteoarthritis, it's been found to have chondroprotective effects. There have been some studies in horses, a couple that I know of. In one equine study of senior horses that were like 15 to 22 years old, and they actually had they were lameness score of 3, so they were visibly lame. And and they fed 2,000 milligrams per day of powdered resveratrol for 10 days, so not very long, followed by 18 days at 1,000 milligrams per day. They saw altered levels of something called superoxide dismutase. And the reason why superoxide dismutase is important is it is a potent antioxidant. So resveratrol seems to have a role in the production of superoxide dismutase. And so it suggests that it potentially has a protective effect over oxidative stress. So that was an interesting study. And then in another one, they didn't have any significant difference on pro-inflammatory cytokines between treatment and controls when they were giving 450 milligrams twice a day for 3 weeks. So this is the case. You do research. Some studies says, yeah, it's great, it's amazing, it does something. And then the next one says, no, it doesn't do anything. And it can be hard to really, to kind of, form a really this absolutely works, it absolutely doesn't work. Because different research shows different things.
So what are these mussels? Are we talking about horses eating fish again? Are they that type of mussel?
Yes, they are.
They are?
Yes.
Yes, more fish-eating horses.
Well, yeah, and it actually ties into when we talked about that last, which is on our fat episode, because they are a good source of polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. So all of that we talked about then applies to these critters. But they were kind of popular, I feel like, over a decade ago now, and then they disappeared. And I feel like they're making a bit of a comeback. They are green-lipped mussels. I haven't actually seen a picture of one. Their Latin name, here's a word for everybody, Perna canaliculus. How's that? That is their Latin name. So they're a marine mollusk, and they're from New Zealand.
Interesting.
Yes. And they've been investigated as for joint health because of those omega-3s in them. But they also have glucosamine those gags. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Or if you think about, I don't know if you've ever seen a mussel, but they have all kinds of cartilage. I don't know if it's really cartilage, but, they have connective tissue. That's the word I was looking for in them, right? I mean, that's kind of what they are. And so it would make sense that they provide a source of those gags. And they also have bioactive peptides. So these compounds, they exert anti-inflammatory effects by regulating inflammatory pathways and reducing production of pro-inflammatory compounds. And again, there is a study in horses, actually a fairly recent one, 2021, a review that reported green-lipped mussel extract had some efficacy in people with osteoarthritis. And then in the equine studies, supplementation has been associated with reduced lameness scores, improved response to joint flexion tests, and then reduced joint pain compared to the control horses that weren't on the mussel. So we don't have, larger randomized controlled trials to confirm, these results, but that's the same with many of these studies. So current evidence would suggest that it's possible that these green-lipped mussel, supplements might actually provide valuable ingredient for joint management. So it's one that's making a bit of a comeback in some joint supplements.
Is there anything new out there that has caught your eye?
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by a plant extract that's got a trade name called Epitalis. I'm actually trying it with my horses because, they're like, we get experimented on. Whenever I'm curious about something, it's like, yeah, let's buy some and try it. So it's a proprietary plant extract. Here's another Latin name from the Biota orientalis seed. And I find this fascinating. I just find it people that study plants and then look at compounds in plants,
botanists?
Right? Well, yes, I know they're botanists. Thank you, Jill.
You're welcome.
That really look at plants from the perspective of the compounds in them and the medical actions and, drug actions and things they might have. I find that fascinating. I mean, so many of our pharmaceuticals originated from plants, right? I mean, it's just, you're giving me that look. Okay, anyway, so the only product on the market that I know that has this ingredient in it is a joint supplement called Foresight Equine. And it's sort of an emerging nutraceutical. It's actually in the US now. It came, I think, from Australia. And sort of mechanically, the epitalis appears to exert, like, it seems to work as an anti-inflammatory, and it also seems to have chondroprotective effects. And so specifically, it seems to inhibit something called prostaglandin E2 within the joint environment, and it seems to modulate the cartilage matrix, sort of metabolism of the cartilage matrix. So it's a very interesting ingredient, and there have been some experimental models. I don't know that there's any work actually in actual live horses, but there is some experimental model of osteoarthritis to support that it actually is modifying the disease. So they've like really shown some potential for it to reduce inflammatory mediator levels. And it actually seemed to result in changes, like radiographic changes in the joints when they were treated with this supplement. And that was work done in 2022 by Seabell and others, which to me is a bit mind-boggling if it's really doing that. So again, there aren't any large-scale randomized clinical trials, but the current evidence suggests that it might be a novel, ingredient and a way to manage arthritis in our horses. So I'm trying it to see what it does.
That's a feed-through?
Yeah, it's a liquid. So it comes in a pouch and with a syringe, and I mean, you can give it orally. My horses love it, and it does taste, it's quite sweet. Alternatively, I mean, I've also just put it in their feed, just squirted it on their feed, but it is a liquid. But the palatability seems really high.
You mentioned earlier that some formulas contain ingredients that support soft tissue, and some you've mentioned, like MSM, can help joints and soft tissue. What other ingredients are being included for soft tissue support?
I think the two that you'll probably see most commonly would be collagen and silica. And of the two, I lean more towards silica than collagen. So I've seen some pretty good data to back the inclusion of silica. Silica has a beneficial role in collagen formation. And since collagen is the foundation of all your bone, tendons, and ligaments, obviously having, adequate silica is really important. There are varying levels of varying sources of silica. You can use zeolite, you can use, clays, montmorillonite clays, but they have very varying levels of bioavailability. And the most bioavailable, to my knowledge, is a liquid, which is called orthosilicic acid. And it's really bioavailable. And there's actually some good work in horses showing it's bioavailable. Zeolite is also bioavailable in horses, but it's not as bioavailable as the orthosilicic acid. And, strangely, there are zeolite supplements out there that are outrageously expensive, and they're more expensive than the liquid, orthosilicic acid. So I don't know why you spend more money on the version that's less bioavailable. Doesn't make any sense to me. But
They
I think
must have a horse on the bottle.
I think they're just owned by companies that are very good at marketing and have people promoting them that horse owners trust, and so they get a lot of recognition. And the liquid versions are, I think most people haven't even heard of them, and so they're just not known. But they're my go-to for sure is to find a liquid orthosilicic acid, but. Collagen's kind of interesting to me because collagen, I feel like, has become very popular, especially in these like broad category joint soft tissue products. There's a lot of collagen being put in these things. It's becoming very popular. And collagen is this, it's a structural protein in connective tissue, including cartilage and ligaments, which is why it gets put in there. And, it's interesting because it's in there because it provides amino acids that support cartilage repair and reduce joint pain. But to get to the joint, to get to where you need them to be, it has to be broken down into the amino acids, right? To be absorbed. You can't absorb whole collagen. So I don't really know how it's supposed to be having an effect when it's going to get broken down into its composite amino acids before it gets absorbed. And there is some really interesting work in people that I'll get to in a minute. But the thing about collagen is that it's made up of 28 different compositions. There's a lot of collagens out there. right? And we're probably aware of that when you go to the health food store, or golly, even I was just in Costco, and they using collagen peptides for sale there, right? Like collagen's become really popular, and there's like 28 different members with differing compositions, and so the type of collagen you need, the right type of collagen for the effect that you're wanting to get, and type 1 collagens represent 90% of the organic matter in bone, tendon, and ligament, while type 2 accounts for 80% of the total collagen and cartilage. So it makes sense that you'd be looking for those forms of collagen. And, that's why collagen's become so popular, is it's just such a huge component of cartilage, right? However, while I was doing some research not that long ago, I was getting ready to speak at a veterinary conference in Canada, and I was doing some research looking at, varying joint supplement ingredients, and I kind of took a bit of a dive into collagen because I've just had this question of I don't understand how it's supposed to be working. Most of the collagen available on the market are from animal origins, right? So most of the time it's chicken or beef or in some instances shellfish, and they come in both soluble and insoluble, what we call native type 2 collagen. And when collagen is in that form, in its native triple helix form, because collagen is actually a triple helix, it's a really interesting compound, and then it gets broken into smaller and smaller pieces and one single strands and what have you, until you get into the peptide versions that we sometimes take and put in smoothies. That's so removed from the original collagen, it's hardly the same thing. But the type 2 collagen, native type 2 collagen in people has been found to actually trigger an immune response. And so when you take it orally, your immune system actually recognizes it, because when there are certain forms, I always thought for the longest time, right, that we have rheumatoid arthritis, which is our kind of as an autoimmune disease, right? And we have osteoarthritis. And when we think about osteoarthritis, we're thinking about, we're thinking about arthritis as the result of an injury most commonly, right? So you've had an injury that's damaged the joint, or just repetitive wear and tear to the joint, whereas rheumatoid arthritis is the result of an autoimmune situation. It turns out that we've learned in people that there is a form of osteoarthritis that is actually autoimmune. And what's happening is that when that joint gets damaged and you're breaking down your collagen in that joint, your body is reacting to that collagen and having an immune response, which is part of what's happening when you have an inflammatory response to that, right? It's actually an immune modulated response. So what they do is they actually provide intact triple helix collagen orally to people, and their body responds to that and has a mild immune reaction to it because it's familiar with it. And then they start to not respond to the breakdown of collagen that's happening in their own body. It's fascinating. So you actually reduce the amount of inflammation that's going on in the joints because you kind of calm the immune system down. It's like when you do allergy shots, right? You have an allergen, you have an allergy, and you give allergy shots, and you kind of calm down your response to the seasonal allergy because you're taking allergy shots. It's that idea. And I thought this was fascinating. I've talked to lots of people about this, and nobody's looking at this work nobody's done this in horses. So I don't know that this exists in horses, but it exists in people. And I thought it was fascinating.
But somebody should study it in horses.
Yeah. I mean, I had some conversations with several people at AAEP, the big vet conference, when I was there in Colorado a couple of weeks ago, with some of the larger pharmaceutical companies. And that do joint work, and they were like, so we'll see if anybody does anything with it, or whether anybody does go and look at it or not. But it's definitely in the human world, it's definitely starting to be studied. So as far as what we know about using collagen right now in horse diets, it's fairly limited. There's actually a study this year where they fed 50 grams, that's a lot, of hydrolyzed collagen supplements. I shouldn't say that. It was a 50 gram per day of a hydrolyzed collagen supplement. That's how it was described. But this is where reading research papers gets interesting because it made it sound like it was a hydrolyzed collagen product. But when you really looked at it, it also had turmeric powder, MSM, glucosamine, HCl, resveratrol, chondroitin sulfate, silica, sodium hyaluronate, and boron in it. And so it did have a benefit in these, in the horses that it was fed to. It was fed to foals that had joint degeneration, and they had reduced inflammation and less joint degeneration than the control foals. And it was the title of the paper kind of implied it was a collagen supplement. But I don't know how you pull out the effect of collagen from that supplement because it was fed with so many other things that it wasn't just looking at collagen. So yeah. So I think it's hard to decipher specifically, how collagen is working right now in joints. But it has become quite a popular ingredient, and it'll be interesting to see what future research tells us.
So this is normally when I ask you if there's anything else you want to cover, but I have something I want to say, and then you can wrap it up.
Okay, I'll shut up for a second.
Recently, I considered switching joint supplements. When I got my horse, he was 8, and he's been on the same one since I got him, and he's now 14. So, maybe we need to change something. Mm-hmm. So I went online to start comparing other joint supplements to the one I was currently using. And I would say if you are in the market for supplements, I strongly suggest, I know everybody goes to Facebook and says, what joint supplement do you really like? That's fine. Once you figure out, dwindle that list down, go look at the active ingredients and look at how much is actually in them, because my mind was blown at the price of some of these supplements and how little they actually offered. I mean, I understand that most joint supplements are going to be, like, as far as supplements go, they're probably one of the more expensive supplements that are out there. But there's no way I'm paying more money than I'm already paying when I'm getting way less active ingredients. So I was mind blown at how, when I looked at the active ingredients, how little there was in some of those supplements. So that is what I want people to take away is, like, if you're shopping for them, you better go look at those active ingredients because you might be surprised. Now it's your turn. You can wrap it up.
And you were going to ask me if there's anything else we hadn't covered, and you stole my thunder. No, I mean, that's literally what I was, going to your point, though, is exactly that, right? We need to talk about labeling and claims, right? Because I think that this is a category that is rife with illegal claims. I mean, they can be just egregious, like just crazy what these companies will say. So, yes, we're giving these supplements because we want to reduce joint damage, and, they're not supposed to say that they can prevent arthritis or that they're anti-inflammatory or reduce pain and lameness. And those are flat out drug claims. They're not allowed to say that. They can only make structure function claims.
And when we say they're not allowed to say that, legally, they are not allowed to say that. I mean, you and I see this all the time because we know that they should not be saying those things. And again, mind blown when we're scrolling through social and there's all these companies saying this stuff that you're just like, you can't say that, and you also can't prove it. Keep going with yours.
Well, that's a big thing, right? So you can't say, reduces arthritis or inflammation. You can't treat, you can't prevent, you can't cure, you can't mitigate or similar overt or implied disease claims, right? And if you mention the name of a condition, you're not probably supposed to do that, right? Because you're implying that you're going to heal that condition. And so those are flat out drug claims. And to make those claims, you need to have conducted an FDA study on your drug to prove that it will in fact do what you say. And that's, multiple studies at multiple locations. I mean, there's a reason why drugs are really expensive. Real drugs are really expensive. Is the process of getting approved as a drug is extensive and extremely expensive. And supplements, so health supplements, we do have an episode on this, but like supplements fall into two categories: feed supplements or health supplements. Health supplements can make structure function claims. So they can support, they can maintain, they can promote normal function, right? So they could help your horse have a normal inflammatory response to exercise. They're not anti-inflammatory, and hopefully listeners can appreciate the difference. So, that's a structure function claim, right? But as you said, we see all the time, and you can't say reduces blah, 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 or increases blah, 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 because by how much, right? Compared to what? They're not quantifiable statements, right? So, there's some gray area words. So they can cautiously do things like, aids or relieves, but even that's a little bit wishy. I think that's kind of gray area, right? But it's hard. It's hard on the companies that play by the rules when they're playing in a field with people that don't play by the rules, and not much gets done about the people that don't play by the rules, let's be honest.
But I think it's important that you say this too. If companies are making illegal claims, how well do they actually understand the market? Right?
Right.
They're not following the rules. So do they even know the rules? And if they don't know the rules, what do they know about this product and what they've put together?
Right. And that's what I struggle with. I really struggle with companies that claim that they're, that they make these. You're exactly right. I mean, it's like, because I'm always like, and maybe it's an honest mistake. Maybe they really just didn't know and they just leapt into the marketplace and didn't know. But it always gets my hackles up a little bit and always kind of makes me, like you said, question whether they really know what they're doing. And do I really want to recommend a product to somebody that I don't really know what they're doing? And the answer is no. And I struggle with companies that claim that their entire product is proprietary. Like I've run across one of those recently, and it's very popular. And they won't disclose. So on a health supplement, you should have active ingredients and inactive ingredients, and the amount of the inactive ingredients per dose should be listed, whatever that is. And you can get away with putting 3 or 4 of your ingredients together, for example, and saying, these 4 things make up 5 grams of the product, and it's a proprietary blend. Well, I can't tell how much of each of those 4 ingredients you've put in there. I just know that altogether it comes up to 5 grams, right? That's a way of disclosing what's in your product, but keeping the sort of, keeping it proprietary, so to speak. And so when you've got companies that are listing out their inactive ingredients, but don't tell you anything about any of them out because they say they want to keep it proprietary, I'm like, there's ways to do that where you can keep it proprietary and share at least some suggestion of whether what's in your formula might actually do something or not. I still don't love it, but it's better than nothing. And yeah, I had this conversation with somebody just recently about this, and they're not disclosing what's on their product because they don't want people to copy it. And I'm like, that's like, I get that too, but I don't know. I don't think people are that interested in copying other people's products, really.
That assumes that what they say is on the label is actually in the container.
Yeah, and the research has shown that it isn't always the case, right? So it's another reason why I tend to stick to the larger, well-known name brands. Is maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like I have a little more confidence in, that they are doing what they say they're doing. I also, look for products that have the NASC seal. So that's the National Animal Supplement Council, and that is an industry group that some supplement companies belong to. And to be a member of NASC, you have to have your products audited, and they actually audit them to make sure they say in them what is actually in there. And they also have a supply chain auditing, so like you have to say where all your ingredients are coming from and all that kind of thing. So the caveat is that it does not mean that the product is effective or that the product will do anything. It just means that the amount that they say is in there, right? So I don't want, listeners to think that, my product with 5 grams of HA in it has a NAS seal on it, therefore it must be great. I mean, it means that there will be 5 milligrams, 5 milligrams of HA, right? So if you've got a product that has 5 milligrams of HA on it, And so a NASC seal, I mean, that's great because you have confidence that there really is 5 milligrams in there. But, based on what we were talking about earlier, 5 milligrams isn't going to do anything for your horse. It's not going to be effective. So it's not an efficacy seal. It's just a quality seal, if that makes sense.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.